History is filled with men destroyed by weakness. King Charles XII of Sweden was not one of them. At 18 years old, the young king of Sweden faced three kingdoms determined to dismember and tear his empire apart. They saw a boy king. They saw weakness. What they found instead was an indomitable warrior. For years, Charles XII did the impossible. He defeated larger armies. He humbled kings. He seemed invincible. But victory taught him a dangerous lesson, that he could not fail. Charles XII never learned how to lose, and in the end, victory conquered him. To understand King Charles XII, one must first understand that he was not a typical monarch. Born in 1682, Charles inherited the Swedish throne at just 15 years old after the death of his father, Charles XI. Europe expected a child. What emerged instead was something far more dangerous. Unlike many princes of his age, Charles had little interest in luxury, courtly intrigue, or aristocratic excess. He preferred hunting to banquets, cold forests to royal palaces, action to ceremony. While other young nobles pursued comfort, Charles pursued hardship. He rode for exhausting distances, endured bitter weather without complaint, participated in dangerous hunts that tested both nerve and endurance. From an early age, he seemed determined to master not others, but himself. Yet physical toughness alone does not explain Charles XII. Many men are brave. Few possess an iron will. Once Charles committed himself to a course of action, persuasion became nearly impossible. He did not bend easily. He did not retreat willingly. He did not forget an objective once it had seized his mind. Friends admired his quality. His soldiers revered it. His enemies would come to fear it. In another man, such stubbornness might have appeared reckless. In Charles, it often looked like greatness. By the age of 18, he possessed many of the qualities people instinctively admired in leaders: courage, discipline, conviction, endurance, self-mastery, and perhaps most importantly, an unwavering belief in himself. It was a combination that made him uniquely formidable. Charles XII did not seek danger. He simply seemed incapable of being intimidated by it. Soon, Europe would discover the difference, and it would underestimate him only once. In 1700, Charles XII's enemies made what appeared to be a perfectly rational calculation. Sweden was ruled by an 18-year-old king. Its empire stretched across the Baltic. Its resources were limited. Its enemies were many. If they struck together, Sweden would surely collapse. And so they did. Denmark-Norway moved first. King Augustus II of Saxony, Poland-Lithuania attacked Swedish possessions in Livonia. And to the east, Tsar Peter Alexeyevich Romanov the Great of Russia prepared to seize the Baltic provinces that stood between him and the sea. 3 kingdoms, 3 fronts, 1 young king. For most rulers, this would have been a moment of panic. For Charles XII, it was a call to action. There was no council debating surrender, no search for compromise, no attempt to buy time. The young king had made his decision. He would attack immediately. Crossing the seas with remarkable speed, Charles landed his army near Copenhagen. The move stunned Europe. Kings twice his age hesitated, whereas Charles advanced. And within months, Denmark was forced from the war. The first member of the coalition had fallen swiftly and decisively, but the greater test still awaited him. To the east, Peter the Great had assembled an army that vastly outnumbered the Swedish forces. Many believed the war was already decided. King Charles, of course, disagreed. In November 1700, near the town of Narva, he marched directly toward the Russian army. outnumbered, outgunned, and utterly unconcerned. As snow and wind swept across the battlefield, the young king led his soldiers into the storm. What followed was one of the most astonishing victories in military history. The Russian army collapsed. Thousands surrendered, others fled, and Europe stared in disbelief. The boy king had survived. More than that, he had announced himself. The battle lasted only hours, but by nightfall, Peter's army had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Europe struggled to comprehend what had happened. Narva changed everything, not merely for Europe, for Charles himself. At 18 years old, he had faced impossible odds and won. The lesson most men would have learned was confidence. Charles learned something more dangerous. He learned that audacity worked. Again and again, victory seemed to confirm it. He marched into Poland, defeated army after army. He dethroned kings, installed rulers of his own choosing. Enemies who should have crushed him instead found themselves fleeing before him. With every triumph, his legend grew. So did his certainty. Years earlier, courage had made Charles formidable. Now it was becoming something else. He no longer appeared capable of imagining defeat. To his admirers, this looked like greatness. To his soldiers, it looked like destiny. To history, it would eventually look like hubris. Yet the transformation was subtle. Charles did not become lazy. He did not become corrupt. He did not surrender himself to luxury or vice. His tragedy was far more difficult to detect. The qualities that had made him successful remained unchanged. His courage, discipline, relentless determination, and his refusal to yield. The difference was that success had removed their restraints. Victory had become a kind of intoxication, and Charles had been drinking from it for years. And like all intoxications, it altered judgment while convincing its victim that nothing had changed. The young king who once calculated risks increasingly seemed willing to challenge fate itself. And fate, of course, was waiting. In the East, Tsar Peter the Great had not surrendered. He had learned. While Charles chased victories across Europe, Russia was transforming. Its army grew larger, better trained, more disciplined, more dangerous. A reckoning was approaching. Charles just could not see it. Or perhaps he simply believed he could overcome it, as he always had before. In 1708, King Charles XII made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He would invade Russia. Not raid it, not negotiate it, destroy it. For years, Peter the Great avoided the decisive collapse Charles sought. Whenever the Swedish king struck, the Russians withdrew. Whenever he advanced, they retreated deeper into their own territory. They refused to fight the kind of war Charles wanted, and with every mile eastward, the problem grew worse. Villages were abandoned, supplies were burned, roads disappeared into wilderness. The Russians yielded land, but they preserved their army. For most commanders, these were warning signs, but for Charles, they were obstacles, and obstacles were meant to be overcome. After all, every previous challenge had ended the same way, with victory. Why should this be any different? The question sounds foolish now, but at the time, it sounded perfectly reasonable. History often looks obvious in reverse. It rarely feels that way, though, while it's unfolding. The deeper the Swedish army marched, the harsher the conditions became. Food grew scarce, horses died, replacements became impossible. Winter approached. Still, Charles advanced. Some leaders are defeated by fear. Charles XII was vulnerable to the opposite problem. He feared retreat more than disaster. The winter of 1708 1709 became one of the coldest Europe had experienced in generations. Men froze where they stood. Animals collapsed in the snow. Entire units simply vanished, without battle, without glory, without an enemy in sight. Nature had entered the war, and nature was winning. Yet even now, Charles refused to abandon the campaign. The same will that had carried him through impossible victories continued to drive him forward. It had become impossible to separate his greatest strength from his greatest weakness. Charles XII still believed. His soldiers still followed, and somewhere ahead waited the city of Poltava, the place where destiny would finally present its bill. By the summer of 1709, the Swedish army was a shadow of the force that had crossed into Russia. Years of campaigning, months of privation, and one brutal winter had taken their toll. The army that had once seemed unstoppable was exhausted, hungry, and far from home. Yet Charles XII remained committed to victory, as he always had. Then, fate intervened, not through strategy, not through politics, but through chance. Shortly before the decisive battle, Charles was wounded in the foot by enemy fire. The injury left him unable to lead from horseback, and for perhaps the first time in his military career, the king who had always fought at the front would watch much of the battle from a stretcher. A small detail, at least it seemed so at the time, but history often turns upon such details. Ahead stood the Russian army, but this was not the force Charles had shattered at Narva. Peter the Great had spent nearly a decade rebuilding it, training it, disciplining it, learning from every humiliation handed to him. The student had finally become dangerous. In the morning of June 28th, 1709, the thunderclap, Poltava, the battlefield upon which two visions of Europe would collide. The Swedish army numbered roughly 20,000 men, the Russians significantly more, fresh, prepared, entrenched, and waiting. Even now, Charles chose attack. He always had. That was the source of his greatness, and now it would become the source of his ruin. The battle began in confusion. Orders were delayed, units became separated, momentum vanished. The precision and aggression that had once terrified Europe seemed absent. The machine no longer moved as it once had. The Russians held. Eventually, they advanced. For years, Charles XII had been the storm, but at Poltava, for the first time, he found himself standing against one. The Swedish line began to buckle, then break, then collapse. Thousands were killed, others fled. The army that had once humbled Europe ceased to exist as an effective fighting force, and with it died the dream of Swedish supremacy. The battle itself lasted only hours. Its consequences would last centuries. Most military defeats are merely defeats. Poltava was something else. It was the moment reality finally caught up with Charles XII. For nearly a decade, every gamble had succeeded. Every risk had paid off. Every obstacle had yielded. Victory had taught him that audacity could overcome anything. At Poltava, though, he discovered its limits. Not because he had become weak, not because he had become corrupt, not because he had lost his courage, because courage alone is not enough, and because even the greatest virtues become dangerous when they cease to recognize restraint. King Charles XII survived Poltava. His legend, however, did not. For years afterward, he continued to fight, continued to campaign, continued to chase the victories that had once seemed inevitable. But the spell had been broken. The momentum was gone. The future belonged to Russia now. Tsar Peter the Great of the newly proclaimed Empire of Russia emerged transformed. King Charles XII emerged diminished. History had chosen its victor. And in 1718, while campaigning in Norway, Charles XII of Sweden was killed, 36 years old. A king, a warrior, a man who had spent nearly his entire adult life at war. His story is often remembered as a military tragedy, but it is more than that. Because Charles XII forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Weakness destroys many people, but strength destroys people too. Courage without wisdom, conviction without reflection, determination without limits. The qualities that elevate a person can also consume them. Charles XII never learned how to lose. For years, that made him extraordinary, but eventually, it made him vulnerable. History remembers many men conquered by fear, many conquered by greed, and many conquered by weakness. King Charles XII of Sweden was conquered by victory. And that is what makes his story unforgettable.